2021 on the stream. We marked 1 decade of war, but we also candidly asked, does anyone even care anymore? Since then, we've seen other conflicts take over the headlines. But have a listen to what our guests, Dr. Zahir Sahloul and Alia Malik, had to say.
What's happening in Syria is affecting a whole generation of children. The Syrian crisis started with children calling for freedom, and 55,000 of them have been killed since the beginning of the crisis. Their life expectancy was cut down by 13 years in the 10 years of conflict, and they still are the main victims of the crisis. And unfortunately, the international community does not have a solution for them to end this crisis and move towards peace and justice.
You know, children are quite literally the future. And I just think, how can you build a future on, you know, for this generation and with this generation, by this generation, when the trauma is so immense and there isn't really a possibility to remediate it by asking for justice or accountability.
This week, UNICEF warned that 12.3 million Syrian children are in need of aid both inside the country and in the wider region where they've fled since the war began. To discuss this, we have Juliette Touma. She's Regional Chief of Advocacy and Communications for UNICEF in the Middle East and North Africa. Juliette, thank you for being with us. I want to ask you straight off the top, we've heard a lot of different concerns around the welfare, the well-being of children in Syria. What is the most pressing matter on your mind?
Ahmed, first of all, let me thank you for having me, but more importantly, sincere condolences for your loss over the killing of Shireen Abu Aqli. Thank you very much. What concerns us most is the fact that 11 years down the line, the needs of Syrian children are huge. In fact, last week we recorded the highest number of children in need inside Syria. And it was on the eve of the Brussels conference where we have asked for urgent funding that we needed for Syrian children.
Yeah, you know, when we talk about that urgent funding, looking at a tweet from AJ Plus, wrapping up some of these statistics, you know, Syria Relief saying that over 100 schools will be closed by August. This is obviously going to have ramifications that go far beyond that. You know, we know 1.75 million, that's almost 2 million children in Syria are out of school. Obviously, that increases the risks of them, you know, confronting kind of tougher life realities such as child labor and child marriage. How realistic is that connection? What's the immediate need?
Do you mean for education specifically?
Yeah, like in terms of, you know, if they're out of school, how large is the risk then they might fall into tougher life realities?
Very large. In fact, we have seen education crisis developing over the past decade. So we're talking about half of Syrian children who need to be in school, they're out of school. And the longer children stay out of school, UNICEF knows that from other settings, the more difficult it becomes to get children back to school. So they do indeed fall prey to child labor and child marriage. And in the case of Syria, we've seen many, many children sadly joining the fighting.
Right, and you know, it's really tough to imagine. It's been over 10 years, and yet it's so seldom that we actually see any real focus, at least in the media, quite frankly, these days, put on Syria. Andy Warrior kind of talking about this disparity and how far we've come in YouTube, saying to us, I think the world should stop caring and interfering and leave Syrians to fend for themselves. They can take care of themselves. They were doing a pretty good job. Obviously, a little simplistic, possibly, in terms of a criticism, but this notion of who's responsible at this point, Juliette? Where do you try to draw the most attention, or where do you expect to get the most support for these children?
Look, it's not really UNICEF's concern to point fingers or to say who is responsible. What really matters to us is that children in Syria and in the neighboring countries have been suffering for way too long. And until the adults finish fighting and until a diplomatic political solution is found, we have to, all of us, continue help children in Syria and in the neighboring countries. The needs are huge. The ripple effects of the Syria crisis into Syria's neighboring countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, Egypt is phenomenal. These countries have been so generous, taking on almost 6 million refugees over the course of the years. We can't give up on Syria's children and the children of the region.
And really protracted conflicts obviously making that all the more challenging, you know, with what's happening in Ukraine and Russia and the fallout. I do want to ask you before I let you go, Juliette, still in our region, if you will, mental health really a taboo. I do know that thousands of children have been identified as needing psychosocial support due to trauma, and that this also might mean that they're less likely to get that important support. How big an aspect is that in terms of where the needs are for these children?
Huge. The children of Syria not only live in a war, they live in a war inside them. They've seen atrocities that no one should see. I mean, when I was in Syria, I remember meeting a child who was, I think, about 7 or 8 years old, and all he talked about was about death. And he used the word death so many times, and it was just mind-boggling that a child his age knows what death means. He's witnessed death. He spoke about it, and he was just so numb. And it was just one child, and there's many, many children like this. And so the needs of mental health are immense. We do know that children inside Syria, especially those living in areas where the conflict is ongoing, like in the northwest, they have trouble sleeping, they bedwet, they cry all the time, they're clingy. And so that aspect is often underreported and is often unspoken about for a number of reasons, but the needs are really, really high.
I'd like to thank you for speaking to us today in general and about this, Juliette. We look forward to speaking with you again.